Death, as it turns out, is incredibly liberating. Listening from the shadows outside the grand ballroom of the street, Regis, I heard my husband raise a glass to his late, tragic wife, and the thrill of my new reality set in. I hadn't just lost my marriage to another woman, I had literally lost my life, and dead girls don't have to play by the rules. It takes a very specific kind of psychopath to look his wife in the eye, kiss her forehead before leaving for a business trip, and then officially pronounce her dead to the rest of the world. But that was Simon Crawford, brilliant, charismatic, and entirely hollow inside. We met at Stanford. I was a sleep-deprived software engineering major running on cold brew and anxiety. He was an MBA student with a smile that could disarm a firing squad. When we started our tech company, Novus, I was the architect. I wrote every line of the proprietary algorithm that predicted supply chain failures. I lived in the dark, staring at dual monitors in our cramped Palo Alto apartment. Simon was the front man. He wore the tailored suits, shook the hands on Sand Hill Road, and sold the dream. I didn't mind the shadows. I loved him. I thought we were building an empire together. We married quietly at a courthouse in San Francisco, saving our meager seed money for server costs rather than a wedding reception. I was Mrs. Lily Crawford, officially and legally. Though in the industry, I kept my maiden name, Bennett, strictly for GitHub and developer forums. The shift happened when Simon finally hooked our white whale, Charles Sterling. Charles wasn't just a venture capitalist. He was a Silicon Valley kingmaker. A billionaire who had built and sold 3 telecom companies before turning to private equity. Securing Charles's backing didn't just mean Series A funding, it meant prestige, access, and an express elevator to the billionaires' club. But Charles was notoriously selective. He only invested in founders he felt a deep, personal connection with. Suddenly, Simon was spending weeks in Seattle, supposedly working closely with Charles's inner circle. My calls went to voicemail. My texts were met with brief, dismissive replies. In a meeting, Chloe, call later. When he did come home, he looked at me not with love, but with a cold, calculating detachment, as if evaluating a piece of obsolete hardware. The unraveling of my reality began on a mundane Tuesday afternoon. Simon was away in Seattle again. I was organizing our home office when a heavy, cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed to Simon, with a return address from an elite event planning firm in Seattle. Thinking it was an invoice for a corporate event we needed to expense, I opened it. It was a proof of a charity gala invitation. You are cordially invited to the inaugural gala for the Lily Bennett Crawford Memorial Foundation, hosted by Charles Sterling and Simon Crawford, honoring a brilliant light extinguished too soon. I stared at the heavy cardstock until the gold foil letters blurred. Memorial? Extinguished? My hands trembled as I sat at his desk. Simon was meticulous, but he wasn't a coder. I was. It took me less than 15 minutes to bypass the 2-factor authentication on his private accounts, using a backdoor I'd built into our home network years ago. What I found in his sent folder made the blood freeze in my veins. It was an email thread with Charles Sterling, dating back 8 months. Charles, I don't know how to type these words. The grief is unbearable. Lily passed away Tuesday night. It was a sudden, massive cerebral aneurysm while she was visiting estranged relatives in London. By the time I flew out, she was gone. At her family's insistence, the funeral was strictly private. I am shattered. I don't know how to go on, but I know she would want me to finish what we started with Novus. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. He had killed me. I kept reading, nausea rolling in my stomach. I saw Charles's replies heartfelt, devastatingly empathetic. Charles's own wife had died of cancer a decade prior. Simon hadn't just faked my death, he had weaponized it. He used a fabricated tragedy to forge an unbreakable emotional bond with a billionaire mentor, but it didn't end there. As I dug deeper into his messages, a new name appeared. Victoria, Charles Sterling's daughter. Victoria has been my rock through this dark year, Simon wrote in an email to a publicist. She understands loss. We found each other in the wreckage. The pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. If Simon divorced me, California's community property laws meant I would walk away with half of Novus, crippling the company right before its massive IPO. Furthermore, a messy divorce would shatter the illusion of the noble, dedicated genius he played for Charles. Charles despised scandal. But a tragic widower, a brave, grieving husband pouring his broken heart into his startup, that was a hero. That was a man Charles would treat like a son. That was a man Victoria Sterling, an heiress with a penchant for fixing wounded men, would fall madly in love with. To the elite circles of Seattle and Silicon Valley, I had been dead for nearly a year. Meanwhile, I was sitting in our house in Palo Alto, ordering takeout and pushing code updates to his servers. I didn't cry. I think the betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly monstrous, that it bypassed my tear ducts entirely and settled directly into my spine as cold, hardened steel. I looked at the digital clock on the desk. 3:14 p.m. Simon was scheduled to return on Friday. I had 3 days to plan my resurrection. When a man proves he can bury you alive without shedding a single tear, you don't confront him. You don't scream, and you don't ask him why. You pick up a shovel and start digging his grave. My first call wasn't to the police. Faking a spouse's death to a mentor isn't technically a crime unless insurance fraud is involved, and a quick check of my life insurance policy showed it remained untouched. Simon was smart. He wasn't after $1 million payout. He was after $1 billion empire. My first call was to Alaric Kensington. Alaric was an aggressive, terrifyingly brilliant corporate litigator who specialized in high-net-worth tech divorces. He was famously known as the Silicon Valley Grim Reaper. I had met him briefly years ago at a mixer, back when I still attended networking events. Sitting in Alaric's austere, glass-walled office overlooking San Francisco, I laid out the proof, the printed emails, the gala invitation, the server logs showing my continuous work on Novus over the past 8 months. And finally, perfectly preserved in a plastic sleeve, my certified marriage certificate. Alaric, a man who had seen tech CEOs hide money in crypto, shell companies, and mistresses' names, actually took off his glasses and rubbed his temples. "Let me ensure I am fully comprehending this, Lily," Alaric said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Your husband, the CEO of a company valued at roughly $400 million, informed his lead investor that you died of an aneurysm. He is now publicly dating the investor's daughter, operating under the guise of a widower." "That is correct," I said, my voice shockingly steady. "And you are entirely, legally alive." I checked my pulse this morning. Yes. Alaric, a dark, predatory smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a shark tasting blood in the water. "Does he know that you know?" "No. He thinks I'm at home, maintaining the back-end infrastructure for the upcoming beta launch." Alaric leaned forward, tapping my marriage certificate. "Simon is banking on the fact that he can secure the Series C funding, marry Victoria Sterling, and then quietly force you into a corner. He likely plans to offer you a massive offshore settlement to sign a retroactive annulment or a quiet divorce, using his new billionaire backing to crush you legally if you resist." "I don't want a settlement, Alaric," I said, leaning in to match his intensity. "I built the algorithm. Novus is my brainchild. He is just the salesman. I want my half of the company. And I want him destroyed. Not just financially. I want the illusion he built burned to the ground in front of the people he lied to." "Well," Alaric murmured, pulling out a legal pad, "California is a community property state. Without a prenup, which you don't have, you own 50% of his shares. By committing this elaborate fraud, he has egregiously breached his fiduciary duty to you as a spouse and business partner. But if you want theatrical destruction, timing is everything." I pulled a printed screenshot from my bag and slid it across the mahogany desk. It was an announcement from an exclusive society blog in Seattle. Tech wunderkind Simon Crawford to wed heiress Victoria Sterling in lavish engagement gala at the St. Regis this Saturday. "He's proposing publicly," I said. "Or rather, celebrating the private proposal. The entire Sterling family will be there. The board of directors. The venture capitalists. Everyone who thinks I'm buried in a fictitious grave in London. Alaric looked at the announcement, then up at me. Do you own a cocktail dress, Mrs. Crawford? Over the next 48 hours, I became a ghost preparing to haunt the living. Alaric moved with terrifying speed. He drafted a devastating legal bomb, a petition for dissolution of marriage citing severe fraud, an emergency injunction to freeze all of Simon's assets, and a claim to 50% of the voting shares of Novus, backed by incontrovertible proof of my intellectual property. We had the documents legally notarized, bound in a stark, intimidating black folder. But legal vengeance wasn't enough. I needed access. The Saint Regis engagement party was heavily guarded, invite only. I couldn't just walk through the front doors. I needed an inside man. I called David Mercer. David was the original chief financial officer of Novus, a good man whom Simon had ruthlessly ousted and bought out for pennies on the dollar right before the sterling investment. David despised Simon almost as much as I was learning to. We met at a dive bar in Oakland. When I told David the story, he choked on his beer. When I told him my plan, he laughed so hard he cried. He told them you were dead? David wheezed, wiping his eyes. Lily. He's throwing a party to celebrate his engagement to a billionaire's daughter, while his actual living wife is sitting in Oakland, drinking a gin and tonic. David reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy gold-embossed envelope. I received a pity invite. They invite the ousted founders to these things to show no hard feelings for the press. I wasn't going to go. But now? I wouldn't miss this for all the stock options in Silicon Valley. You're coming as my plus one. Saturday arrived. The night of the engagement gala. For 6 years I had dressed for comfort, hoodies, jeans, blue light glasses. I was the invisible worker bee. But tonight, the ghost was dressing for her own funeral. I bought a dress I couldn't afford on my own credit card, which was technically tied to Simon's accounts. It was a floor-length, deep crimson gown that fit like a second skin, a sharp contrast to the pale, tragic memory Simon had painted of me. I had my hair styled in loose, aggressive waves. I wore a striking blood-red lipstick. I looked nothing like the exhausted coder he had left at home. I looked like a reckoning. In my designer clutch, folded neatly, was my certified marriage certificate. Alongside the emergency asset freeze injunction Alaric had secured from a judge that very afternoon. David picked me up in a rented town car. As we drove across the Bay Bridge toward San Francisco, watching the city lights glitter against the dark water, my heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. You ready for this? David asked quietly, adjusting his bow tie. I looked at my reflection in the tinted window. The nervous, accommodating girl who had spent her 20s building another man's dream was gone. In her place was a widow who had survived her own murder. I've never been more alive, I said. The street Regis was a fortress of luxury. Valets rushed to open doors, photographers flashed cameras at arriving tech royalty, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. Through the massive glass doors of the grand ballroom, I could see the glittering chandeliers, the towers of champagne, and the string quartet playing softly in the corner. And there he was, Simon, standing at the center of the room, looking devastatingly handsome in a custom tuxedo. He was holding court, a tragic, brave smile on his face, his arm wrapped protectively around the waist of Victoria Sterling, a stunning, ethereal blonde wearing a diamond ring roughly the size of a quail egg. Next to them stood Charles Sterling, looking at Simon with the profound pride of a father. David handed our invitation to the sharply dressed woman at the guest list podium. She scanned it, smiled at David, and then looked at me. Name for the plus one, sir? She asked warmly. I didn't let David answer. I stepped forward, my voice clear and melodic, loud enough to catch the attention of the security guard standing nearby. Lily Crawford, I said. I'm the groom's wife. The music didn't stop immediately. For a few agonizing seconds, the string quartet continued to play a delicate Vivaldi piece, entirely oblivious to the detonation that had just occurred at the entrance of the grand ballroom. But the security guard heard me. The sharply dressed woman at the podium heard me. And most importantly, the cluster of tech executives standing nearest to the door heard me. A ripple of whispers began to propagate outward, slicing through the polite laughter and clinking crystal like a scythe. I didn't wait for permission to enter. I bypassed the podium, my crimson heels sinking into the plush imported carpet, and began my long walk toward the center of the room. David walked a half step behind me, a silent, grim-faced sentinel. As I moved deeper into the ballroom, the crowd naturally parted. It wasn't just my dress, it was the sheer, terrifying gravity of a woman walking toward her own funeral pyre, carrying a bucket of water. Simon was mid-laugh, his head tilted back, a flute of vintage Krug in his hand, when his eyes finally locked onto mine. I have spent years analyzing data, predicting system failures and structural collapses. I know exactly what it looks like when a critical infrastructure gives way. The collapse of Simon Crawford's face was spectacular. All the blood drained from his cheeks in a single, sickening rush, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. The smile didn't just fade, it snapped, leaving his mouth slightly open in a rictus of pure, unadulterated terror. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble tile at the base of the ice sculpture, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sound of the breaking glass finally silenced the quartet. The ballroom fell into a suffocating, echoing hush. Simon? Victoria Sterling's voice was light, laced with confusion. She looked down at the broken glass, then followed his paralyzed gaze toward me. Darling, what's wrong? Who is she? I stopped exactly 3 feet away from them, close enough to smell the expensive sandalwood cologne he wore, close enough to see the microscopic bead of sweat forming at his hairline. "Hello, Simon," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of that room, it carried like a gunshot. "Your trip to Seattle seems to have run a bit long." Simon opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. He looked like a man drowning on dry land. Charles Sterling, the billionaire kingmaker, frowned. He stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. His gaze swept over me, assessing, cold. "Excuse me, young woman. I believe you are in the wrong venue. This is a private celebration." "I know exactly where I am, Mr. Sterling," I replied, holding his gaze with absolute calm. "I'm here to offer my congratulations to the groom." I turned back to Simon, a razor-thin smile touching my lips. Though, traditionally, the first wife is supposed to be divorced or actually dead before the second engagement party is thrown. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. I heard a woman near the back drop her purse. Victoria recoiled as if she had been physically struck. She looked at Simon, her blue eyes wide with panic. "Simon? What is she talking about? Is this some kind of sick prank?" Survival instinct is a powerful thing. Simon finally found his voice, though it was a desperate, reedy octave higher than normal. "Security!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Get her out of here! She's a stalker." An obsessed former employee who was fired. He lunged forward, trying to block my path to the Sterlings, his hands trembling violently. "Charles, Victoria, I swear to you, this woman is deeply unwell. She's been harassing the company for months. Please, just ignore her." 2 burly security guards in dark suits began pushing their way through the paralyzed crowd, reaching for my arms. "Take your hands off her," David Mercer barked, stepping directly into their path. David had a commanding presence, and the sheer authority in his voice made the guards hesitate. David looked at Charles Sterling. "Charles, you know me. I was the CFO of Novus. I sat across from you during the first round of seed negotiations." Charles's eyes narrowed. "I know who you are. David, what is the meaning of this circus?" "It's not a circus, Charles," David said grimly. "It's a rescue mission, because the man standing next to your daughter is a pathological fraud." David gestured to me. "This is Lily Bennett Crawford, the chief architect of Novus, and, very much alive, Simon's legal wife." "Lies!" Simon screamed, his polished veneer completely disintegrating. He looked frantic, cornered. "She's a hacker. She forged documents. My wife died in London. I unclasped my designer clutch. My hands were perfectly steady. I pulled out the black legal folder Alaric had prepared and held it out. Not to Simon. To Charles Sterling. Inside, I said clearly, ensuring the entire front row of tech royalty could hear every word. You will find a certified copy of our California marriage certificate, dated 4 years ago. You will also find an emergency injunction signed by a Superior Court judge 2 hours ago, freezing every single asset Simon Crawford possesses, including his shares in Novus, due to egregious marital fraud. Charles Sterling didn't move. He stared at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake. Then, slowly, he took it from my hands. He opened it. The silence in the room was so profound, you could hear the soft rustle of the thick legal paper. Charles read the first page, then the second. I watched his jaw clench, the muscles ticking furiously beneath his weathered skin. This was a man who prided himself on his infallible instincts, on his ability to read people. Simon had made him look like a gullible fool in front of his entire empire. Charles slowly closed the folder. When he looked up at Simon, his eyes were devoid of any human warmth. It was the look of a financial executioner. "Charles, please," Simon begged, tears actually springing to his eyes. "I can explain. It's complicated. She left me. She abandoned the company. I had to protect the investment. I had to protect you. You told me," Charles said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, "that you held her hand as she flatlined in a London hospital. You wept in my living room." "I was protecting the narrative," Simon pleaded, reaching for Victoria. Victoria physically shoved him away, her face twisted in absolute disgust. "Don't you dare touch me," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage and humiliation. "You sick, twisted sociopath. You used my dead mother. You used my grief to get close to me." She stripped the massive diamond ring off her finger and threw it hard against Simon's chest. It bounced off his lapel and rolled away across the marble floor. "Victoria, wait." But she was already turning, pushing her way blindly through the crowd, sobbing. Charles Sterling stepped into Simon's personal space. "You are radioactive," Charles whispered, though the acoustics of the room caught the threat perfectly. "By Monday morning, you will not have a company. You will not have a reputation. If you ever contact my daughter again, I will make sure the SEC investigates every single breath you took while soliciting my capital under fraudulent pretenses." Charles turned to me. He gave a single, stiff nod of acknowledgement respect from one ruthless predator to another, and walked out, following his daughter. The room erupted. The spell was broken. Guests were whispering frantically, pulling out their phones, snapping photos of Simon, who was now literally on his knees on the marble floor, frantically looking for the discarded ring amid the shattered glass. I looked down at the man I had married. He looked pathetic, small, stripped of the illusion I had helped him build. "I'll see you in court, Simon," I said softly. I turned around, and with David by my side, I walked back out of the street Regis, the flash of smartphone cameras lighting my path out of the darkness and back into the world of the living. The implosion of Simon Crawford was not a slow leak. It was a spectacular, catastrophic detonation that shook the foundations of Sand Hill Road. By Sunday afternoon, the society blog that had breathlessly announced the engagement published a retracted, sensationalized update detailing the St. Regis scandal. By Monday morning, TechCrunch and the Wall Street Journal had the real story. The headlines were brutal. Silicon Valley wunderkind fakes wife's death for VC funding. The karma hit with the blunt force of a freight train. Simon had built his entire strategy on optics. He believed that if he looked the part of the tragic genius, the world would bow to him. He forgot that the venture capital world doesn't run on empathy, it runs on risk assessment. And Simon had just become the highest risk asset in California. At 9:00 a.m. on Monday, the Sterling Group officially pulled their Series C funding, citing a breach of the morality clause in their term sheet. This triggered a massive panic among our earlier investors. At 11:00 a.m., the board of directors of Novus, the company I built in a dark Palo Alto apartment, held an emergency vote. I didn't even have to use my voting shares to swing it. The board unanimously terminated Simon Crawford as CEO for cause, stripping him of his severance package and locking him out of the corporate servers. But the real fatal blow came from the federal government. Alaric Kensington, true to his reputation as the Grim Reaper, hadn't just filed divorce papers. He had anonymously forwarded the entire cache of emails between Simon and Charles Sterling to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Faking a death to your friends is a terrible thing to do. Faking a death to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital from investors whose decisions were influenced by the false narrative of your sole ownership and grieving stability, that was wire fraud. That was a federal crime. On Wednesday, 4 days after the gala, I sat in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at Alaric's law firm. Across the mahogany table sat Simon. He looked like a corpse. His custom suit was wrinkled, hanging loosely on his frame. He hadn't shaved. The dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older. He was accompanied by a harried-looking junior defense attorney who kept checking his watch. Simon stared at the table, refusing to look at me. "Mrs. Bennett Crawford," Simon's lawyer began, clearing his throat. "My client is prepared to offer an amicable settlement. We are willing to concede a 30% equity stake in Novus, provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the personal misunderstandings leading up to this dissolution." Alaric actually laughed out loud. It was a terrifying barking sound. "A non-disclosure agreement? Counsel, your client is the subject of 3 major exposés this week. There is nothing left to disclose. Furthermore, my client owns 50% of the community property, plus the intellectual property she authored before the corporate entity was finalized. 30% is an insult. We are taking the full 50, and we are forcing a liquidation of his remaining shares to cover the damages for breach of fiduciary duty." "You can't do that," Simon snapped, finally looking up. His voice was ragged, desperate. "Lily, you can't. If you force a liquidation now, with the SEC investigation pending, the shares are worthless. You'll destroy the company. You'll destroy your own code." "The code is fine," I said evenly. "I backed up the entire repository to a secure private server the day I found your gala invitation. Novus, as an entity, might burn. But the algorithm is mine. I can rebuild it. You can't." Simon stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and profound realization. He finally understood that he had underestimated the wrong person. He had treated me like a silent accessory, a piece of software he could just uninstall when he needed more memory. "You planned this," he whispered, leaning across the table. "You sat in our house, eating dinner with me, smiling at me, knowing you were going to gut me." "No, Simon," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I sat in our house and worked on our future while you planned my funeral. I just decided I wasn't ready to be buried." I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored skirt. "Alaric will handle the rest. I don't want to see you again." "And Simon?" He looked up, a pathetic glimmer of hope that I might show some final shred of mercy. "When the feds ask you to surrender your passport," I said coldly, "make sure you tell them about all those imaginary trips to London." I walked out of the conference room without looking back. The fallout was swift and merciless. Simon's assets remained frozen indefinitely as the SEC launched a full-scale probe into his communications and financial disclosures. Facing mounting legal bills and potential prison time, he was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. The man who had almost married into a billion-dollar dynasty was currently living in a rented studio apartment in San Jose, fighting a federal indictment. As for me, the board of Novus, desperate to salvage the underlying tech from the PR nightmare, offered me the position of Chief Technology Officer and a seat on the board, backed by a new coalition of investors who appreciated cold, hard data over charismatic lies. I didn't take it. I didn't want to salvage a tainted brand. Instead, I used my undisputed ownership of the core algorithm to negotiate a quiet, highly lucrative buyout from a massive logistics conglomerate. I walked away with a fortune, my maiden name restored, and my intellectual property fully credited to Lily Bennett. I was dead for nearly a year. But the life I built after I resurrected myself? That was an empire they could never touch. The final chapter of Simon Crawford's destruction wasn't written in a glittering ballroom or a Silicon Valley boardroom. It was written in the cold, sterile light of a federal courthouse, but not before an unexpected meeting took place in the quiet fog of the Presidio. A week before Simon's sentencing, I received a secure message from a private assistant. It was an invitation for coffee from Victoria Sterling. We met at a secluded cafe overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. The heiress who had once worn a diamond the size of a quail egg looked entirely different. She wore a simple beige trench coat, her hair pulled back, her eyes shielded by dark sunglasses until she sat down in the booth across from me. She ordered a black tea. I ordered my usual cold brew. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, two women bound together by the phantom gravity of a sociopath. "My father wants to crush him into dust," Victoria said softly, tracing the rim of her porcelain cup. "He has an army of lobbyists pushing the SEC to make an absolute spectacle of the trial. But I wanted to see you. I needed to see the woman I was supposed to be replacing." "You weren't replacing me, Victoria," I said gently. "You were just the next acquisition. We were both just assets to him." Victoria let out a bitter, jagged laugh. "He told me he held your hand when you died. He described the hospital room in London. He told me the exact song that was playing on the radio. How does a human being invent that kind of detail without a soul?" "He's a compiler," I explained, leaning forward. "He takes data, human emotions, grief, ambition, and he compiles it into whatever program gets him the result he wants. But algorithms without ethical constraints eventually crash. That's what happened." She reached across the table and briefly touched my hand. It was a fleeting, astonishing gesture of solidarity from a woman who existed in a different stratosphere of wealth and power. "I'm glad you're alive, Lily," she whispered. "And I'm glad you're the one who burned him down." 6 days later, I sat in the polished oak gallery of the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. Judge Nathaniel Rosenberg presided over the case. He was a formidable, no-nonsense jurist who had built his career dismantling corporate fraud. Simon stood at the defense table. The transformation was complete and devastating. The tailored Tom Ford suits were gone, replaced by a drab, ill-fitting gray suit provided by his overworked public defender, William Hawthorne. Simon looked hollowed out. His hair was thinning, his posture stooped. Without the borrowed billions and the stolen genius to prop him up, he was nothing but a fragile shell of a man. When Judge Rosenberg delivered the sentence, his voice boomed through the silent courtroom like thunder. "Mr. Crawford," the judge stated, peering over his reading glasses, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have seen men steal from pensioners, and I have seen executives cook the books. But the sheer psychological depravity of fabricating the death of your own spouse to manipulate the grief of an investor is a special breed of malice. You weaponized human empathy for venture capital." The gavel fell. 84 months. 7 straight years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, securities fraud, and severe obstruction of justice, to be followed by millions in court-ordered restitution that Simon would never be able to pay. As the bailiffs moved in to handcuff him, Simon turned around. His eyes scanned the gallery until they locked onto mine. There was no anger left in his expression. There was only a vast, terrifying emptiness. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply looked back at him, entirely unmoved, until he was led through the heavy wooden doors and out of my life forever. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding California sun. The air tasted sharper, cleaner. Over the next 3 years, I didn't just fade into a quiet retirement with my buyout money. I am an architect. I build things. Using the massive capital from selling the original Novus algorithm, I founded a new cybersecurity and data logistics firm called Aegis. I brought David Mercer on as my CEO, handling the front-of-house operations, while I stayed exactly where I belonged, in the command center, writing the unbreakable code that powered the future. Aegis didn't just succeed, it eclipsed everything Novus had ever hoped to be. We secured government contracts, defense infrastructure deals, and enterprise-level logistics. But the hardest, most poetic strike of karma didn't hit Simon in the courtroom. It hit him in his cell. 9 months into his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lompoc, Simon was finally granted access to the prison's digital commissary and external communication tablets. It was a miserable, heavily monitored existence where inmates paid exorbitant fees by the minute to send emails or buy instant coffee. According to David, who still kept tabs on the industry gossip, Simon sat down at his metal bunk, turned on his federally issued tablet, and waited for the operating system to boot up. When the screen flickered to life, it didn't just load a generic login prompt. It loaded a sleek, dark mode interface. And right in the center of the screen, beneath the Department of Justice seal, was a small, elegant logo, encrypted and powered by Aegis Analytics. He was trapped. Every digital letter he wrote, every phone call he made, every cent he spent on ramen noodles and soap was processed, routed, and secured by the architecture I designed. He thought he could bury me and build an empire on my grave. Instead, I built the very walls of the digital cage he would live in for the rest of the decade. I used to be a ghost in my own life, a silent partner, a tragic excuse, a dead woman on a billionaire's pity invite. But dead girls don't have to play by the rules. We just rewrite the code. Was that the most satisfying karma you've ever heard? Or what? Lily didn't just beat Simon, she literally built the system he's trapped in. If her incredible comeback story had you cheering at your screen, hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant revenge plot, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable, true-to-life stories of justice served cold.